The strawberry you see in grocery stores today shouldn't exist. Not in this size, not in this sweetness, not in this form. Because the modern strawberry was never discovered in the wild. It was born from a biological accident, a cross between two species that had evolved on different continents for thousands of years. No scientist planned it. No farmer designed it. Nature and chance did something unexpected, and humans later realized they were looking at an entirely new fruit. What we call a strawberry today is not the original strawberry. It is a hybrid creation that rewrote the history of one of the world's most loved foods. To understand how strange this really is, you have to go back to a time when strawberries were barely noticeable, long before agriculture, long before orchards and farms. Wild strawberries grew low to the ground in forests across Europe, Asia, and North America. These early species, especially the woodland strawberry, were tiny, often no bigger than a fingernail. They were intensely aromatic, but not consistently sweet, and their yield was low. People gathered them as seasonal treats rather than reliable food. Archaeological evidence suggests humans were eating wild strawberries thousands of years ago, but they were never a staple crop. They were a rare bonus from nature, not something anyone depended on. In ancient Rome, strawberries began to gain cultural importance. Roman writers mentioned them not just as food but as medicine. They were believed to help with fever, inflammation, throat infections, digestive problems, and even melancholy. But the fruit itself still looked nothing like what we know today. It was small, fragile, and difficult to transport. No one farmed strawberries commercially because the wild plants didn't produce enough fruit to make cultivation worthwhile. For centuries, strawberries remained a wild luxury enjoyed when found, but never fully domesticated. During the Middle Ages, strawberries took on symbolic meaning across Europe. In Christian art, they represented purity and humility because the plant grows close to the ground. Monasteries and royal gardens began transplanting wild varieties closer to human settlements. This wasn't large-scale farming. It was more like careful gardening. Even then, the problem remained the same. The flavor was excellent, but the fruit was tiny. If strawberries were ever going to become a true crop, something had to change. That change began during the Age of Exploration, when European powers started moving plants between continents. In the early 1500s, explorers traveling through North America encountered a wild species later known as Fragaria virginiana. Compared to European strawberries, this variety had stronger flavor and aroma. French explorers described fields where the berries grew naturally in abundance. For the first time, Europeans saw a strawberry that had both taste and productivity. Plants were collected and taken back to Europe, where gardeners began growing them alongside local species. But the real turning point didn't come from North America. It came from the southern coast of Chile. In the early 18th century, a French engineer and explorer named Amédée-François Fraisier observed a completely different type of strawberry grown by local communities. This species, later called Fragaria chiloensis, produced berries that were much larger than anything seen in Europe. The flavor was milder, but the size was impressive. In 1714, Fraisier transported several plants back to France. At the time, no one realized how important this decision would become. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Chilean plants struggled to produce fruit in Europe. They grew well, but yields were low. What no one understood at first was that the plants needed compatible pollination from another species. The Chilean strawberries were eventually planted near North American varieties, already growing in European gardens. And then something happened that no one planned. The two species cross-pollinated naturally. No experiment, no deliberate breeding, just proximity, insects, and chance. The result was a new hybrid plant that combined the large fruit size of the Chilean species with the strong flavor and productivity of the North American one. Gardeners began noticing plants that produced bigger, sweeter berries than anything they had seen before. In the mid-1700s, a young French botanist named Antoine-Nicolas Duchenne studied these unusual plants. Through careful observation and controlled experiments, Duchenne confirmed that a completely new hybrid species had formed. He documented how the crossing worked and showed that the modern strawberry was not a wild species at all. It was a hybrid created by accidental cross-pollination. That hybrid became known as Fragaria times ananassa. Every large strawberry you eat today traces back to this moment. But here's a question: if two plants from opposite sides of the world had never been placed next to each other, would the strawberry we know even exist? Once growers realized what they had, the next phase began: selection. Farmers started choosing plants that produced the largest fruit, the best flavor, and the highest yields. Over generations, this process intensified the traits people wanted. By the 1800s, commercial strawberry cultivation had spread across Europe and North America. The fruit was still delicate and perishable, but transportation improvements allowed it to reach urban markets. In the United States, strawberry farming expanded rapidly in the 19th century. Regions with mild climates and long growing seasons became major production centers. As refrigeration and rail transport improved, strawberries went from a local seasonal treat to a nationally distributed fruit. Breeding programs focused on firmness, shelf life, disease resistance, and uniform shape. The goal was no longer just taste, it was consistency and durability. By the 20th century, strawberries had become one of the most intensively bred fruits in the world. Scientists discovered that the garden strawberry has a complex genetic structure. Unlike most fruits, which have 2 sets of chromosomes, strawberries have 8. This genetic complexity allows breeders to combine traits in powerful ways, but it also makes the plant's history unusually layered. Each modern variety carries genetic material from multiple ancestral species, reflecting centuries of crossing and selection. At this point in the story, it's worth stepping back for a second, because what started as a wild forest berry has turned into a global agricultural product grown on millions of acres. The modern strawberry is bigger, sweeter, firmer, and more productive than anything nature originally produced on its own. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the real history behind everyday foods, hit like and subscribe, because once you start looking at food this way, you realize your grocery store is basically a museum of human experimentation. Today, strawberries are grown on every continent except Antarctica. The United States is one of the world's largest producers, with California alone supplying the majority of the country's fresh strawberries. Modern farming uses advanced irrigation systems, climate management, and disease control to produce fruit year-round. Some varieties are bred specifically for fresh eating, others for freezing, processing, or flavor concentration. But even with all this technology, the foundation remains the same accidental hybrid created in 18th century France. What makes the strawberry even more unusual is that the part we eat isn't technically the fruit. Botanically, the red flesh is a swollen receptacle. The actual fruits are the tiny seed-like structures on the surface, called achines. Each one contains a seed. That means a single strawberry carries hundreds of individual fruits on its surface. Another reminder that this plant has always been biologically different from what people assume. Over time, strawberries also became culturally iconic. They became associated with freshness, summer, and indulgence. They appear in desserts, jams, beverages, and processed foods worldwide. But their popularity wasn't inevitable. Without the accidental meeting of 2 species from different continents, strawberries might have remained small woodland berries, never becoming a major crop. And that's really the core of this story. The modern strawberry isn't just a product of nature. It's the result of exploration, global trade, accidental hybridization, scientific observation, and centuries of selective breeding. It represents a moment when the movement of plants across the world created something entirely new, something no single ecosystem had ever produced. Today, when you see perfectly shaped strawberries lined up in a store, it's easy to think of them as ordinary. But behind that simple fruit is a chain of events stretching from ancient forests to European royal gardens, from Chilean coastlines to French botanical experiments, from accidental pollination to modern agricultural science. One unexpected cross changed everything. And if there's one takeaway from this story, it's this: most of the foods we think of as natural are actually the result of long histories, shaped by human choices, movement, and discovery. So the next time you bite into a strawberry, remember you're not just tasting a fruit, you're tasting an accident that became an industry, a forest berry that became a global crop, and a piece of food history that traveled across continents before it ever reached your plate. If this kind of deep, real, myth-free food history caught your attention, subscribe and stick around, because the everyday foods you see around you, their stories are way stranger, deeper, and more fascinating than anyone tells you.